So our next step is going to be the belt. Now to do the belt, we are using a stretch material because we're using it for the gloves and the boot covers as well. But I am going to line it with a twill to give us some structure. So basically we're going to redraft the center part of the body, try it on, take it in a bit because I want it to be, you know, a little cinchy but not too much, and go from there. So on my body, I'm going to measure up a little bit more than I think it's going to be, which for me is 3.5. And we are going to use the two sides again. I like to put the center front on the fold because then it already has. So this is the top, this is going to be the waist. I'm going to do the same in the back, knowing that I will probably have to adjust it. And before I get too far, I'm gonna draw a new line on the back and give myself some zipper seam allowance. Now for me, I want to put a zipper in the back because she doesn't actually have any closures that you can see on the entire thing. And then I'm going to measure down more than I think it's going to be, which is 5. And then I'm going to draw a right angle out from the side for all 3 of these. So now I'm going to measure all across those 3 areas. And the waist can cinch in a bit. I don't want to cinch in too much because I still want to be comfortable. So I'm just writing down right on the fabric what that measurement is. Then I'm going to measure down that same distance we had before and measure across. And go up. Well, it's a little easy because these 2 measurements are the same apparently. We'll see how that actually fits. And I'm going to divide these by 4 because the front in and of itself is half, the back is half, but we're working on 1/2 of the front, which is 1/4 overall of the measurement. So that's actually easy. It's 10.25 for me. And 15, 7.5. And I like to just write the measurements down. Now my widest measurement is this lower measurement, so that's the one I'm gonna start with because we don't wanna make this come in way too much. If we make this come in, it's gonna look weird. And my eyes are gonna be like, wait, what? And it's not gonna fit on the body. The difference between these 2 measurements on your body is all the way around. It's not just at the side, so we need to take it in all the way around, not just at the side. So I'm gonna start with marking my side seam here on both. Now, I don't like to go in more than about 1 inch, which would put me here. All I did was made a line straight up here and measured in 1 inch. We'll do the same on the other side. I'm using a quilter's ruler because I can't find my good ruler. And the quilter's ruler just has marks that are 1 inch. If you don't have this, you can just draw a line straight up and then measure in 1 inch. So I know that this is actually 9.25. And the difference between 9.25 and 7.5, oh no, is 1 3/4 inches. So I'm just gonna write that down here. Okay, circle it so I know. So I know that I need to put a dart in that's 1 3/4 inches and then goes back down to 0. I like to, on myself, measure about where that dart is going to be. I just find it easier so that I know. And it should be in line with the apex, which is usually the nipple. And then you know exactly where you want that dart, or the center of that dart to be. And then I'm gonna draw all the way up and all the way down. Nope, that's the wrong line. That's cool. This line. I mean, I might as well connect these 2 while I'm here. Didn't mean to connect that bottom one. So we're gonna switch colors again because I find that easier to track. So now with that 1 3/4, we want to equal that on both sides here. And that's where the math comes in again, because 7/8. Whew. Okay, so we're gonna measure out 7/8 on either side. And the trick to that is I just put this middle line on my 7/8 mark, and then I can go out 1 1/4 on the other side. So if I put this at 7/8, I mark it at 0, and then I mark it out 1 3/4. Math. And then the easy part here is we connect these lines, and we may end up having to take this in more because bodies don't usually fit exactly like this. If your body does, congratulations, that's absolutely fantastic, and your pattern making is going to be a lot easier. And if it doesn't, there's nothing wrong with that. So I don't want this line to go all the way down because my body does curve towards the bottom. So I'm going to just eyeball it, do it about a finger width. And then I'm just going to connect this up gently with a very slight curve in. Let's take out that curve. I don't want that. You can use a ruler for this, and I probably should. That would be the smart way of doing it. And then all that's left is we have to connect here on the side, and we're actually going to do this with, come straight, just a gentle curve. We want this to be straight at the waist, and then, whoa, that's a little too much. Curve out just a bit. That's the general shape of hips. So now it's up to you. You can go through and add your seam allowance with a ruler all the way around if that's what you want. You could eyeball it and draw it like that. I like to give a bit extra on the top and bottom. And I'm gonna just cut out as is. And we are just going to make a notch at the top of the darts and at the waistline, just to make sure that we can line all that up. Now the fun part with this is we can sew it or you can pin it. Basically, we're going to sew these darts closed. I'm not going to put a zipper in this, I'm just going to pin it on myself, but let's hop over to the machine and sew it very quickly. So we're going to start with the front. I find that easiest. And because we want this to go straight and then go in, we're going to stick a pin through the straight parts. Whoa. And we're going to pin through the bottom. Then when we flip to the other side, we can actually see where those pins are coming out, which means we can put more pins through. Okay, so we have pins on both sides, and then we can open this up. Ba, 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 ba. Oh, that pin jumped out. And now we know exactly where everything is. So, starting with the side that doesn't have all the marks, if we line up our 2 notches and then fold it along this bottom pin line, our other 2 pins will match up. So what I like to do is then pin them through one and take out the extra pin. So now we know, and with a basting stitch, that we should sew straight down to this pin, taking out the pin before we get there. And then in that last little bit, we're gonna turn and go straight to this other pin. Perfect. And we have a dart. And we're gonna do the same on the other one, which in theory actually has the marks on it, so we can just follow what that says. Perfect, we're gonna put that to the side, and we're gonna do the same with the back pieces. Put those darts in. So the next bit is I'm going to take this front piece again, make sure my darts are down, and I'm going to take my back piece, make sure my darts excess is facing up, like all the extra, and take my other back piece, line up our sides. That way when you look at the inside, it's all the good parts. And I'm going to make sure that I line up my waist notch. That's the important one. You can pin if you're more comfortable that way. And we're just gonna sew all the way down. Now you can see because I didn't measure, my top edge doesn't line up, and that's okay. And bam, it is ready to try on. So I'm gonna try it on with all my seam allowance facing out, so I can pin it if need be. The trick to this, to make sure that this fits properly, is we are going to try this on with the rest of the costume on. So we're gonna throw on the leggings and the shirt to make sure that it looks good together. So let's do that. Okie dokie. So I didn't put any boning in it for the test. You definitely can. It would just hold it in shape more. But overall, I'm really happy with this. It's way too long and way too tall, so I will have to adjust that. It's fitting okay in the back. It doesn't want to stay up. I should have put a zipper in it too. Live and learn. It's staying okay in the back. I think I could take it in just a touch around the center. Do I want to do that? Yeah, just at the very front. So I'm going to mark that the tiniest bit, like 1/8 of an inch, not even. Because I think if I did that, that's what I'm happy with, yeah. And then for the top, hers is like close to, but not quite there. Kind of where it's folding is where it wants to be. And then the bottom, it only really goes to there. It's quite short, because we do actually see that there. So I'm just making marks that I can later finish off. I mean, it all needs an iron. It's not that big of a belt. And then I'm gonna put boning in it when I actually do it, which will hold this down. Now my question is, do I want to take it in at the sides? And I think the answer is yes, just a touch. I think if I take it in that little bit on both sides, yeah, that's gonna sit a little nicer. I don't want it to be too big on the hips. Yeah, so that's the only changes I need. And I'm gonna figure out where those stripes go when it's off of my body. Let's make those alterations. And the first thing I did was cut it straight down that center front line, because we're just gonna work with half of the pattern here. My body is pretty symmetrical, so like most patterns, we're working on the fold here. The next thing I did was actually draw that like fold line so that I knew exactly which piece was the center and didn't lose track. Now, looking at the alterations, the first thing I wanted to do was the top and bottom lines to really cut down how much of the belt we were actually working with. My lines were a little wonky because I drew them on my body, so with my ruler I straightened them out. I did make them square to that center front line so that they would be flat across, and then just kind of used my markings as a guide to go all the way around relatively smoothly. I did the same on the top as well, and made sure to mark both sides of the seam allowance. Then I cut off all the excess, leaving myself seam allowance on the edge of the line that I had just drawn. Now, if you're not comfortable just straight out cutting it, you can, of course, with your ruler, add the seam allowance past that, whatever you're comfortable with, about 1/2 to a full inch. But I just like to eyeball it and cut it because I'm lazy. After that, it was time for the dart alterations. So with a marker, I made a mark as to where I had pinned it before I took the pins out on both sides of the seam allowance with a different color so that I could see where the seam was in the middle, and on the side pieces how much I had taken it in there as well. And then I had to actually take apart all of the darts so that I could then draw on the new lines of the darts. So on the front one where I had taken it in at the middle, I went from that new mark down to where it ended before and then back up to where it ended before because I liked how it sat. And on the sides, I went from that middle mark that we already had established down to the new line on the sides. Just basically connect your new dots to the old lines at the ends. And remember to do it on both pattern pieces on either side of the dart, because there are 2 sides to each dart. Then I cut a seam allowance amount out from the new edge. So all that means is on the new edge, you draw out your new seam allowance and cut along that new line. I also decided to cut the excess from the darts out. I wanted this to be 4 separate pieces as opposed to 2 separate pieces. And I made sure to mark those waist notches again, because I really want to make sure that I can line those up when I go to sew them on all of the pieces. And then it was time to cut out. Now, this is one of my favorite parts. I like to use a medium weight twill inside of something like a waist belt or a semi corset, you could say, because it's not a full corset, just to add some strength and rigidity. The fabric I used on top actually has quite a bit of stretch to it, so I didn't want to rely on that for the structure. So I just have way too much of this twill in my stash. I laid down all of my pattern pieces, making sure that that place on fold center front piece was in fact placed on the fold. And then I realized that I also needed to cut my boning channels, and I wanted to do that out of this thicker twill because I do not want stretch on the boning channels. So I put them along the selvage edge, and I had about 6 channels times 2, so 12 actually. And the way I figured out how wide I wanted them to be is I took my piece of boning, measured it across, and added seam allowance on both sides, plus a little extra because you need space to sew it. I think it ended up being about 1 inch. I did not give myself a lot of space. I highly recommend giving yourself more just to be safe. And I wanted it on all of the side seams, well, not just the side seams. I wanted it on every seam, including the back, and I wanted some down the center front. And then I measured them out, made sure they were longer than the seams that I was covering, and cut them out before I cut out the actual pattern. And because our original pattern was then cut into this pattern, there's actually not quite enough seam allowance at the bottom of the darts, so I made a mental note of that and made sure to give myself just a little more space while I was cutting this out. Now, I didn't use pattern weights or pins or anything because my fabric did not shift whatsoever, and I've been doing this for a long time. But it's perfectly acceptable to use pins or pattern weights. Heck, I've put a shoe on something before just to hold it steady, whatever you can cut around and whatever you have available. Do what makes you comfortable and make sure that the fabric isn't going to shift once you start cutting it. And then it was time to start cutting out the actual fabric that you were going to see on the outside of the belt. I didn't actually have a lot of it. I was very tight. I thought I had way more than I actually ended up having. So I had to unfold the fabric, and then I used my twill pieces as my pattern pieces that I needed to cut out to make sure that they were all facing the right way. Because of course, if you have a left and a right, you want to make sure that when you cut them, they're going to face the right way when you go to sew them. So if you take the pattern pieces apart, you can make sure that they're facing the right way, because you want to make sure you have one left and one right. You can see me playing with the pattern pieces on top, making sure that the visible pattern piece, one, you can see all the lines, and then the second one you can't because it's actually upside down. This is normally what you would get when you place something on fold. One would be facing up and the other would be facing down, if that makes sense. You can see me playing a lot with these pattern pieces, trying to make sure that I get them all right, because I did not have any extra fabric to mess this up. But yeah, you do not have to cut the boning channels out of this fabric. It is just the corset pieces or belt pieces, the pieces that you will actually see. So for this pattern, it was 7 pieces total, and that place on fold piece, we unfolded and placed that first. Next, we're gonna go over to the machine and sew everything together. Now, I like to lay out all my pattern pieces stacked as per what pattern piece it is, and I start with our place on fold, then I put our front side, then the back side, then the back center piece. This way, when we sew everything together, we can just go in order. Now, to keep this all straight, because there is a lot going on, I'm going to do one seam of the twill and then one seam of my good outside fabric and switch back and forth so that I'm always doing the same seams at the same time. You also want to make sure that your thread in your machine is the same color approximately as your good fabric that we're going to see on the outside. As you can see, I start by taking my center front piece and unfolding it. Then I take my front side piece and line up the correct seam to go on that center front side seam. This just means that I'm making sure my good side is facing my good side and sewing that seam together. And then I repeat this with my good fabric, or as it's also called, fashion fabric. This is the fabric we will see on the outside of the belt, and I do this 2 seams the same way. Then we're going to lay everything out flat and make sure that we take our next piece and line up the side seam with the side seam. And again, make sure that the good sides of the fabric are together. I do this with both pieces. It just is about taking your time. Now you can notice here that I am not pinning anything. I don't feel the need to on such a short seam. If you're a beginner or if you would like to have pins, totally use them. It's whatever makes you comfortable. And then we just have to attach the center back piece together. Now this is actually the easiest because that very back line should be straight. I'm going to be putting in a zipper. You could also put in like grommets or something. So it has to be straight. So you want to attach the curved line to the curved line of the front. Again, making sure that your good side is facing the good side. So you're looking at the wrong side when you're sewing it together. When you open it up, you see only the good parts and none of the seam allowance. And our next step is over at the ironing board. We're gonna iron these all flat and we're going to iron the boning channels. This is not something you can skip. You really do have to iron at this point. Ironing boning channels is time consuming, but it is not necessarily difficult. All I did was made sure that I was looking at the wrong side of the fabric. Press them flat first, then I folded over the seam allowance on both sides to the inside, making sure that when I finished, that little bit that we saw, I would still have space on both sides of the boning to stitch it down. So I did double check with my piece of boning just to make sure that it was a little wider on each side than the boning itself. Otherwise your stitches will make it too small. And it is time consuming, but it is definitely worth it. And before we can actually iron down the belt pieces, we have to do something that's called clipping the seams. So this means that where the waist is, we're going to do a little snip so that this notch extends all the way to the sewing line, but not through the sewing line. And we're also going to do that on any curves, just in a couple different spots. This allows the actual fabric of the seam allowance on the inside to lay flat when you try to iron it. Otherwise, what's going to happen is as you iron it, it's going to pull and distort how everything fits. And then we're going to press the seam open with your fingers first. I like to work on the top of the waist piece all the way across, and then the bottom of the waist piece. Because for me, that waist cinches quite a bit. So it's easier to do one half and then the other. If you try to do both, then your panels in between will get folded and you'll accidentally crease them. It's a whole thing. So I do find it easier to go bit by bit. And you will notice that I clip a little bit at the center front seam as well, so that I know exactly where the middle of the outfit is. That was that place on fold line. And I just go through and iron the whole thing. And I also iron the panels in between so that everything is nice and crisp. And then repeat both the clipping and the ironing for our good fashion fabric. And we're back at the machine. Now we need to add some sort of stiffening piece to the waist seam. We're going to add this all to our twill fabric, or our stiffer under pieces, so that we don't see the stitching on the good side of the fashion fabric. This is all going to be invisible structure. I'm just using a ribbon because I don't need this to be super cinchy. You can also use nylon webbing. And what we're going to do is take that strapping or whatever you're going to use, and we're going to sew it all the way across every single waist seam, all the way down, that connects the whole thing in one long piece. So I'm starting at the back seam, and I'm going notch to notch to notch along that center line. I'm going to sew on one side of my ribbon all the way down. And then I'm going to repeat this and sew on the other side of the ribbon all the way down, making sure that all of my seams are pressed open as I sew down. Then I'm going to take one of our boning channels, and while I'm looking at the wrong side of the seam, because we're working on the wrong side of the fabric, I'm going to place the boning channel down so that the extra bits of seam allowance are folded under, and place it directly on top of the middle of the seam. And once again, we're going to sew all the way down one side as close to that fold as possible. Then we're going to sew down the other side as close to the other fold as possible. This kind of gives it a nice clean look where all the seam allowance is folded underneath. And make sure that your seam allowance of the belt is spread as open as possible, nice and flat. That's why we did iron both of these things before we sew it. Then we're going to repeat this on every other seam all the way through. So we're going to do the side seams, we're going to do the front kind of princess seams between the front center and the front side, and repeat on the other side. And again, this is working on our twill fabric, not our good fashion fabric. So this creates the foundation of the garment. I like to add a piece of boning right beside the center back seams where the zipper goes in, so that it doesn't buckle on my back. Now the way I do this is I fold over the seam allowance amount and make sure that my boning channel is placed far enough in that I'll be able to sew the zipper afterwards without having to try and sew through the boning channel. Now, you can always grab your zipper and place it on top of that folded edge to know exactly where you want to place the boning channel, because you're not going to be able to sew through the boning afterwards. Or if you have cheap enough boning, I guess you could, but it is not recommended. As with all of our other boning channels, we're sewing very close to the fold all the way down, And then doing the same thing on the other fold so that the boning channels are stitched down on both sides. This leaves the middle section open to put the boning in and what makes it a channel, in fact. I repeat this on the other side of the belt piece as well, so that we have boning channels on both back pieces. And my last two boning channels I like to put in the very front, from where that front piece meets the front side piece all the way down to the very middle part of the front at the bottom. I find that this really helps smooth down the tummy. That's a point that I'm insecure about. I know a lot of people are as well. And it helps stop this from buckling when you're moving around because your waist does bend and you don't want it to flip or anything. I line it up with that corner piece and sew all the way down, making sure that I'm sewing as close to the fold as possible. And I want to make sure that the bottom point, the inner edge, lands at where that fold line was, where we also put a notch so that we knew exactly where it was. I go back and I sew down the other side of the boning channel. It's looking pretty good. And then I sew the other side of this as well, so that there's two channels, one on each side of that front piece. And now we're on the final bit of sewing before we can add the boning in. Now, all along the top, I'm going to do a nice long basting stitch right on my stitching line so that I still have the seam allowance to one side and the rest of the garment to the other. And you're going to go over all of the boning channels. This means that when we put the boning in, it gets trapped at the top and it doesn't slip out. It's much easier to size the boning with this in place, and it's easier to handle everything if it's closed on one end. And now we're on to my absolute favorite part, which is adding the boning. Now, there's lots of different types of boning you can use: spiral steel, Ridgeline. I myself am cheap, so I like to use zip ties. You heard that right, zip ties. They're flexible, but they also still have some rigidity to them. So what I like to do is go from that bottom line that we sewed, and then go all the way up to where I'm going to sew the top edge, and take off about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch from that measurement and trim my boning to match. I just cut it, it's a zip tie. Then I like to round the edges, or cut the corners so it's not too sharp, and slot it in. Now you can see I kind of do different ones at different times. I have nice long zip ties, so I try and use the whole thing. I don't really want to waste any zip tie. And I kind of jump around which one I'm doing until the whole thing has boning in every single boning channel. Zip ties are more affordable, I will put that out there. Now, because we have made them 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch shorter than the actual boning channel, this means we can now go through and base the bottom line along that stitching line, which means that we have, once again, the seam allowance to one side and the rest of the belt to the other side. This will lock in the boning channels and still gives it a little space to move around. After everything's sewn, this is when I go through and cut all the excess of the boning channels off. It's just easier to do once it's sewn and the boning isn't trying to escape on you. Now what we're going to do is take this foundation piece we've created and lay it down so that all of the stitching, all the boning channels are underneath, and we're looking at the side with just like the stitching lines on it. And we're going to take our good fashion fabric piece and place that on top so that the good side is facing down and we're seeing all the seams. This means that our two good sides are pressed into each other, and we line up every single seam, and then starting at the top or bottom, your choice, you're going to start at that center front notch and sew all the way down to the end, right along that seam allowance line. Now, I like to always start at the center front because that way it's much easier to line up all your seams. If you start at one end and go all the way, sometimes the fabric will stretch slightly differently as you're sewing it and push one part of it a little more and all of a sudden nothing's lining up. So if you start at the center and go to the end, then start at the center again and go to the other end, that is in fact easier. I started at the top, so next I do my bottom, where once again I'm starting at that center front line and going all the way to the end, then flipping it and starting at the center front line again and going all the way to the other end. I will say this is easier when you look at the foundation side because you already have that pre-existing stitching line. But it is possible to do from looking at the fashion side of the garment as well. And really take your time, make sure that you're not sewing through the boning. Remember that we gave ourselves that little extra space to do this. The very final step before we flip it all right side out is we need to trim all of the seam allowance. So I started by doing some notches and then I realized that I don't want all that bulk to be seen on the outside through the fashion fabric. So I actually went through and trimmed everything down to about 1/8 of an inch. If you're not comfortable with that, or if your fashion fabric is thicker than mine is, then what you can actually do is go through and add those notches and clipping the seam like we did when we went to iron everything. So on all of the curves, make little V-shaped cutouts that go to but not through the stitching line. For me, it was just easier to trim it to about 1/8 of an inch all the way across. And now the fun part, when you turn it right side out, and you can finally get to see what your belt is going to look like. This is my favorite part. It feels so good because doing the construction like this means that you have all the structure you want, but there's no stitching lines currently on your good side of the fabric. So now I want to stitch all the way around the top, and I'm starting in just a bit so I can still have my zipper there. And this is just to make sure that we don't see any of the dark brown. I want to make sure that it's only my good fabric we're seeing. And that's great. It's barely noticeable, which is what we want. And I'm going to stitch along the bottom. Now I'm going to start on the same side because I want, if there's any stretching, I want it to go in the same direction. There we go. Okay, so next we have to put in our zipper and then put on our straps, and she's done. When I was cutting this little section here, my notch, I trimmed it too far in. So to fix that, I'm going to take a needle with thread tied on one side, pull it from the inside, and I'm just picking a tiny amount of fabric on each side of that hole. Because this is a stretch fabric, it has a little bit of give. And this is likely going to be covered by the belt piece anyways. But I just wanted to show you that you can fix little mistakes. You don't have to start all over again. Okay, so that's done. What I'm gonna do is give it 2 ties as close to the base as I can. Then I'm going to push the needle down and through the fabric. Pull it all the way through and trim it where it comes through here. And that means that all my extra thread is on the inside, and now it's not really noticeable. Easy peasy. So I ended up with a zipper the closest I could get. It had to be over a certain length and I wanted it separating. So what ended up happening is it's way too long. Better too long than too short. So what I'm going to do is cut the zipper a little above, making sure the zipper pull is below. So if I cut it here, that's more than enough extra. Okay, and I'm looking at the center, making sure I've got this facing up and down. And you just want to be very careful that you leave this down. If it goes too far off, it can pop right off and it's very hard to get back on. And I'm going to place that so it's just the tiniest bit I'd love to set it in just a bit. I'm worried that I won't be able to get the bottom in. And then I'm placing it so that the teeth are at the folded edge. Just past, there we go. There, this is hard to pin, to be honest. And I'm very carefully trying not to let it go in too much or out too much. And then at the top, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it in like this. I'm going to trim that a little more to make sure it's more than the length that we need. I don't like to trim it because I don't want it to pop off. I find in my experience, if you fold it, it can't pop off. You have to be careful when you sew it, but there we go. One side done. And I am going to pin right here because it's flipping more than I would like. When I sew it, I might take a moment and pull this part back more. Yeah, so it doesn't catch. See, you can get an idea of that. So when I go to do the other side, I'm going to leave it in like this because I want to make sure that these bottom parts line up. And I am forcing it over a bit more because I want to cover it as much as possible. What we might end up doing is making a little panel of this fabric that flips over. So now that the bottom's done, so if I know I'm going to put a panel over top, I can actually repin both sides to be out just a little bit to make sure it's not going to catch when I'm trying to zipper it up and down. There. So we're going to repin this side. It's a lot of pinning. I don't do a lot of pinning, but I do when it comes to zippers. And I'm trying not to let it bubble too much because that means that I've stretched it out. So I just unpinned and repinned that part. There we go. Perfect, so now we're just going to sew this down on both sides. So you can do this with like a side stitch. I'm going to try and do this with just my regular foot. It's probably not going to be happy. Let's see how this goes. So you can see I'm keeping the zipper pull at the top. When I get here, I'm going to keep the needle down, push the foot up, and pull that zipper pull all the way down so I can stitch the last little bit. And then I'll have to do this last little bit by hand. But I'm quite happy with that. I can probably get a little bit more on the end there. And now it won't pull out. Ta-da! And now we're going to stitch the other one. Perfect. Great. So I'm going to add a panel to go over this and cover the zipper because I don't want to see it. But let's go back to the cutting table and we'll cut out the belts so we can sew those on and the little flap. So because I'm being very careful with this, I'm going to use the smallest amount. And I'm going to put it on this side to Velcro over onto the other side. And what I'm going to do is I've just folded it the opposite way. And I'm going to measure out, or just mark where the top and bottom are. And I'm going to set this aside and we will cut the belting pieces. So basically, when it comes time, I'm going to sew along here, we'll flip it the other way, we'll sew it down here and it'll flip over. So that can go to the side. Now we're going to look at the belting material. So I've got this vinyl and I really like the look of it as a like fake leather. I don't want to use real leather because I only have so much of it. And what I'm just going to do is walk this along here to get the length, knowing that this is the widest part, so everything will be thinner than that. So that would put me to there. And I'm also gonna want some overlap in the back there. So I would say I want about 2 inches, because I can always get it less. So that is going to be the widest we need, or longest I should say. And now what we need to do is figure out how wide each strap is going to be. She has 3 equal distance spaces. So it's like a space, 1, a space, 2, a space, 3, a space. So in theory we should divide this, but I'm going to find the longest section, 7, which would be 7. So 7 would make each piece about 1 inch. And I just want to visually see if that looks right. Do I have anything that's about 1 inch wide? Oh look, I think I can make this 1 inch wide. Let's do that. I'm a very visual person, so I like to have like an idea ahead of time of what it's gonna look like to make sure that it's gonna do what I want it to do. So it's gonna be kind of like that, slightly less. I think that does actually look right to me. These are slightly wider than it's gonna be, which is fine. Okay, so yes, mine are going to be 1 inch wide because we have 7 spaces, 3 of which have the strips. I'm going to be basically making a piece, and then a side will fold over and be stitched down on both sides. So if I want it 1 inch total, I'm going to give myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side. So it's a 1/2 inch, then I give myself 1 inch, and I'm just using a quilter's ruler because it's nice and easy. It has the grid lines on it. And let's just double check. Oh, that's not right. I think it's fine. And I really like that. It's slightly over 1 inch, which to me is right, just because of the width of the chalk. So I'm gonna do that 3 times, and we're gonna copy that down as well. Now you don't have to put all the lines in. You could actually just draw this as 2 inches. I like the lines because it means that I can double check later on that I'm actually doing it right, if that makes sense. There we go. And just draw this one out. Better to be a little too long. And let's cut these all out. And 3 pieces, meaning this can go away for now. We will need it again for the gloves and the boots. So we're just going to sew these down. So now I'm going to trim that edge. Okie dokie, and we're going to flip this right way out. Now looking at this, we're going to attach Velcro, and I'm going to have the scratchy side down, so it's always down and it's never up. And I'm going to place this on the edge and pin it, but only through 1 layer. And now I'm going to open this up and we're going to stitch all the way around that. And I'm doing this because I only want it on 1 layer. I don't want to see the stitching on the other side. Okay. And then I'm going to run a level of stitching just across here. Well, all around the edges. Okay, so now we have a little flap. So this is going to end up like that. So to do that, we're going to flip it so we can see this side. We're going to stitch it down all the way, then we're going to flip it over and stitch it down again. gonna trim off the bulk here, just on the edges, before we stitch down the next bit. Woo! And you know what? I am going to trim this quite a bit, so it's pretty. Now when we fold this, we're gonna stitch it down again, or we could leave it. I think I'm gonna leave it. This way it's out of the way, because this won't fray. It's out of the way when I go to do this, and then it velcros over. You can top stitch it down if your fabric frays and you're worried about that. Now, the fun part. You know what's gonna be an easier way of doing this? Is grabbing a piece of chalk. I'm gonna fold this over, and then I'm gonna see where this edge is. There we go. And now I have an outline of where the edge of the Velcro should go. And it is just to the side of the boning, so we should be okay. And we'll stitch this down. There. Perfect. Zipper's covered, we can tuck that in. Great. So let's put this to the side and work on the belt. Belting of the belt? I don't know. We're gonna switch to a dark brown. So if I was smart, I'd make my bobbin the same amount so I could fold this over and make sure from this side. However, I'm gonna do this so that my top stitching is the correct color. So I'm going to fold that over, and I've made a mental note of how far over that top stitching is. And I'm just following that line and I'm stitching all the way down. And then we're gonna flip and do the other side. Now the whole idea is that there is no white showing on the inside, so that if we catch a glimpse, it still looks nice. Perfect. On to the next. Perfect. So let's take these over to the table and pin them in place. That's a little bit longer. Just trying to figure out how I want to close it. So I'm going to mark the center all the way across. You could eyeball this. I don't trust my eyeballs. Trim that end, and then this is going to be folded over slightly, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch it in a couple spots in the center of each panel. So I'm going to curve it, mainly because I can't really stitch it on the edges, like where the seams are, because of the boning. It is not easy to pin this. And I think once these are all pinned, I'm gonna try this on and make sure that it's sitting right before I stitch it. And I'm trying to just pin it in the stitching lines. There we go. So there's the first one. Oh. And the next one I am going to eyeball. Okay, last one. Okay, I'm going to try this on quickly, and if all goes well, we'll see you at the sewing machine. Now we're going to stitch every single spot that there's a pin. Time consuming, but easier than hand stitching. Now I'm going to go through and trim all of my threads. So I'm going to undo these. I'm going to grab my Velcro. So this Velcro will stick to itself, but not anything else. This is from 3M hooks, it's leftovers. I keep everything. So I'm going to stitch it on this side. So I'm just stitching 2 lines to hold this together. So I've just folded it under and then stitched it down in 2 straight lines to really stick it down. Then I'm trimming all the threads. I always like to trim the threads as we go because I find that if you don't, you end up with a bunch of threads all over the place afterwards. You're never going to find them all. You're going to be taking pictures and looking at pictures after the convention or after the photo shoot and be like, oh no. If only I had caught that thread ahead of time. So let's just catch those threads ahead of time. Okay, now we just got to figure out where those bits have to go on the other side. Here we go. Okay, so I've made a little bit of a mark where the edge of my Velcro should go. Okay, and we're just gonna put this all the way. I'm gonna trim it after. Okay, let's do this. So I'm gonna sew these in a box shape and then go back and sew them just on this side of, because there's a piece of boning here, I don't want to sew through the boning. This is how we get around it. And I find that back tacking is extremely important on something like this where there's going to be tension. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to do that vertical seam. I'm not worried too much about the thread on the inside, it's just to make sure it doesn't find anything else. So let's see what this looks like. Ta-da! Perfect. It just goes all the way around like a cartoon. So there's the front. Oh, I see a thread. Anytime I see them, I trim them. And there's the back. Hey, hey. So I'm really happy with the belt. The back does pop occasionally. I should have used a slightly stronger, by occasionally I mean constantly. I should have used a stronger, there you go, see, you can see it happen. I should have used a stronger Velcro, or what I honestly should have done is a hook and eye. But it's hard because I couldn't like keep trying it on. But I really like how it looks. It does slip up a bit. You know, when I get bloated and stuff, it pushes it up. So I just have to tug it down occasionally. It helps make my boob shelf look really good. It keeps everything taut. I think it looks good from all angles. I can't see what it looks like in the back, so that's a mystery. You'll have to tell me. And I really like how the lines ended up.